Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am Mary Kane, President and CEO of the Maryland Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for tuning in to our 2024 legislative session recap. In just a few moments, you're going to hear from our expert government affairs team, Andrew Griffin and Hannah Allen, who will provide a detailed analysis of legislation that passed or failed this session and what your businesses need to know and be prepared for in the months ahead. But before we get started, I'd like to take a few minutes to reflect on the 2024 legislative session and the impact achieved thanks to our collective strength of our members, the Maryland Chamber Federation, and our dedicated team. While this legislative session was filled with challenges for businesses, our united advocacy efforts ensured that policymakers heard the concerns and priorities of businesses loud and clear. And this session was truly a great example of the power of our united voice and partnership in creating a Maryland where all businesses and their communities can thrive. Guided by your priorities, this session we focused on responsible government spending, equitable transportation funding, data privacy, military retirement tax elimination, and child care incentives. And our team thoroughly reviewed hundreds of pieces of legislation. We actively opposed damaging proposals like combined reporting, the expanded sales tax on services, and an onslaught of new regulations that would strain companies. We championed 18 key bills, including the Infrastructure Streamlining Act, Transparent Government Act, Keep Our Heroes Home Act, Economic Competitiveness Act, and a Clean Slate Act. And our advocacy defeated dozens of harmful bills that would have pushed Maryland further down the ladder of economic competitiveness. While the legislative session has concluded, our advocacy for a thriving business climate continues. And in the coming weeks, our government affairs team will publish the 2024 legislative report, detailing each bill and position for which the chamber advocated. We will release more data from our 2024 Competitiveness Red Book, focusing on metrics like employment growth, education costs, and taxation, and all essential for assessing Maryland's economic standing. I myself will continue advocating for the business community's interests through my roles on the Maryland Economic Council, the Trane Commission on Transportation, and ongoing dialogue with policymakers and leaders. Additionally, we will continue to support initiatives like the Building Bridges to Recovery Coalition, which aims to ensure businesses statewide receive the resources and advocacy they need to navigate the aftermath of the tragic Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse, and they need to emerge stronger. The successes we achieved during the 2024 legislative session would not have been possible without your contributions to our advocacy efforts. Thank you very much. And now I'm going to pass it over to Andrew Griffin and Hannah Allen, our government affairs experts who tirelessly advocated for our members throughout this session. Andrew and Hannah, thank you so very much for your exceptional work. Enjoy their recap and a look at what's ahead.
Thank you, Mary, and good morning. I know I'm between you and lunch, and I appreciate you all joining today. Like Mary said, I'm Andrew Griffin, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs here at the Maryland Chamber, and my teammate, Hannah Allen, Director of Government Affairs, is on. So you can see from the agenda today, we're going to review, just the Chamber's policy process, what our top priorities were going into session, and then we're going to break out the items we've identified as the things you need to know in each of these policy areas that we oversee. It's a lot. We have an hour, and so it may seem that we move kind of fast on some of these. We do want you to ask questions, and we will try as hard as we can to leave time at the end for questions. So please use the Q&A box for those. If we run a little past noon, you are welcome to stay on. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. But if you have to jump, that's also understandable. So we'll kind of move right into what the Chamber's policy and legislative committee process is here. This is just a reminder. I know many of you are members. So all of our stuff is member driven, right? Our positions are member driven. Our priorities are membership driven. And so We have 10 policy committees that all members can serve on. And they, we break them out into separate buckets on issue areas. And they are, they're really the breeding grounds for and the exchange of ideas for the issues and how we consider bills, the positions, amendments we may offer to bills. All of that runs through the expertise of the policy committees. So once the policy committees have reviewed legislation, made a recommendation maybe for a position or a recommendation maybe for an amendment on a bill, that filters up to our legislative committee, which meets weekly. And the legislative committee, basically, the best way to think of it is it's a higher level set of members that, engage the chamber's positioning on a more strategic basis, looking at, hey, does this make sense for the chamber to take a position on? Does it not make sense? Do we need to be mindful of X, Y, or Z? And they are kind of giving the final approval to what the position that Mary and I will go and execute. So there's a lot of management that we do. For those of you that participate on those policy committees, you know that, but it works very well in how our membership kind of drives our positions. So just as a reminder, every year in the fall around October-ish, we release our legislative priority document going into the session. This year we had 5 top level priorities. This is just a quick review. If you want to read about what they were in more detail, you can find our priority document for 2024 on our website. And those are dealing with business taxes, and I'll talk about why these priorities were where they were in a second. Business taxes, dealing with the challenges around transportation funding the state has, a data privacy component, military retirement relief, and then aiding in some additional military retirement leave for our state's veterans, and then increasing childcare availability and working on affordability. So those are really the top 5 for us. Obviously, these are not the only issues we worked on, but things that we try to be proactive. So before I dive into kind of the first bucket of issues, I do want to set the stage on the political stage as we're heading into the 24 session. So there's a lot of focus on the budget. Most of you are aware of that. The state is kind of heading into the session knowing that there was going to be a little bit of a budget shortfall, knowing that there had been some revenue write-downs. And so, there's a lot of focus and interest in potential revenue raisers. That discussion was happening before we got to January, before the legislative session started. And so a lot of that is there's really 2 main factors. A lot of that is kind of being dragged because of a large education policy and funding proposal that was passed a handful of years ago, commonly called the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. And so that has put a lot of stress on the state budget, but also revenues. Maryland's economy continues to be fairly unique compared to other states. Our economy is a little anemic. We haven't seen folks return to the workforce in the numbers that we have seen in other states. We are certainly adding jobs, but very, very slowly. And this is all heading into the year. So, think 4 or 5 months ago where we were. And so revenue collection has been kind of down from what the expectation was. And so that was really what set the stage going into session. And so kind of taxes were on the brain. Whether or not there was going to be adjustments to this education policy is on the brain. And then what, if any, measures and proposals would the General Assembly consider to kind of jumpstart the economy and kind of keep job growth going were things that we were focused on. So talking about kind of our first policy bucket here is, our policy committee, that we call Cyber and Tech, deals with a wide range of issues. And so there are 2 bills here, but they're very big issues. And so the first is the Maryland Online Data Privacy Act of 2024. You'll see what our formal position was next to the title of the bill, and then what the ultimate, outcome of the bill was below it. So this is an issue that has popped up and has been around. We've discussed and been involved in in Annapolis for the last 5 years, roughly 5-6 years. And this issue really was kind of coming to a head this session. And so we kind of expected the state to look at and pass what we call a large, basically a statewide data privacy law. And so this bill sets out basically rules, guidelines, and ultimately what will be institutes regulations for how private companies can collect, manage, use people's personal data. And it also establishes a framework or a set of consumer rights for individuals to be able to control how their data is used by private entities. And so this is a very, very large piece of policy. A handful of other states have passed something similar to this. And so we spent the majority of our advocacy on trying to bring our proposal here in Maryland in line with what we have seen a lot of other states, as close to what we have seen other states do as possible. The primary purpose for that being, listen, the internet and data and how we interact online is interstate, very much so, and how companies operate is very interstate. And so having a patchwork of very different laws state by state in this issue, on this particular issue, really, proposes a pretty big challenge. And so in the absence of federal action, it was really a top priority for us as the business communities, the state chamber, to make sure we have something that is operable for businesses across state lines as possible. We got a lot of the things that were needed there. There is still some concern on some pieces of the bill that we'll continue to work on. I think the caveat here is this policy does have a delayed effective date, so it does not go into effect until October of 2025. And so that does open the door for us to kind of evaluate the policy that we've passed. And if there are areas that we can still make improvements, potentially in the 2025 session, maybe we're able to do so. So very large policy proposal, which I'm happy to talk more about offline. But just know, listen, if you are a business and you are in some way, shape, or form collecting consumers' personal data, this is going to really have a big impact on how kind of your operations in that sense. So this next bill here, House Bill 905, this is was a bill that was introduced. It did die, dealing with a sales and use tax exemption for qualified data center equipment. So a handful of years ago, the chamber kind of led the coalition to pass a sales and use tax exemption for qualifying data centers equipment, really with the idea of attracting data center investment to the state. So House Bill 905, what it was a proposal to change how you would qualify for that sales or use tax exemption by saying, well, in order to qualify, you have to make certain types of, we'll say, renewable energy investment into your data center. You have to have certain types of a certain percentage of battery power backup into the data center, which really goes above and beyond any sales or use tax exemption that's been used to incentivize this type of investment in the country. That proposal did die. However, I think this is something that is the business community, as we see investment in this area, that we're going to continue to see a high level, we're going to see interest in. And so I think that we will see issues like this continue to come back year over year. And so for those of you that operate in this space, I would certainly draw your attention to that. Okay, taxes. Like I mentioned, there was a lot of focus on revenue and taxes. And so the first item we have here I'll hit is Senate Bill 766 or House Bill 1007. And many of you may have seen this in the news. It's called the Fair Share from Maryland Act. This was a very large omnibus tax proposal. It had everything from new and novel business tax schemes in it, to increases in personal taxes, to some tax cuts. And so there was a lot packed into the bill. For our proposal, our concerns, we were focused on the business aspect of it. And so Senate Bill 766 and House Bill 1007 did contain, for the first time we've ever seen introduced in Maryland, mandatory worldwide combined reporting, which is a tax scheme that we don't see employed here really in the Mid-Atlantic, and would present a pretty significant competitiveness disadvantage for Maryland businesses had it been adopted. There were certainly some fireworks with this, as some proposals of the bill were amended into another bill, and obviously there was negotiations that went up really till towards the end of the session. But I think the good news for the 24 session is more or less the big and scary things, the combined reporting, the throwback rule that we saw put in to the Fair Share for Maryland Act. Certainly it didn't get across the finish line, but I think the business community is going to have to continue to contend with the fact that revenues are going to be back on the table again next year in the 25 session, and these types of proposals are going to be introduced again. And so I think in 25, mentally, we need to be thinking that we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about the state's corporate tax environment and business tax structure again. House Bill 1515, so kind of moving on, House Bill 1515. This is not necessarily new to Annapolis, but it is something we haven't seen introduced in the last handful of years. And this was the introduction of the expansion of the sales tax to services. And so House Bill 1515 lowered the state's sales tax slightly, but it kind of flipped the way we tax services on its head. And so instead of saying here in Maryland, we extend the sales tax to very few services, and those few services are typically for specific reasons. This flipped it and said, well, we're going to extend the sales tax to all services except those that we exempt. So obviously the draw to this type of proposal is it comes with a very big revenue price tag, a very shiny price tag. And certainly when the state is in a position that they need revenues, this is always going to be attractive. However, the biggest component of the revenue here in this piece of this legislation is the business to business services. And unfortunately, that leads to double taxation, right? It leads to increases in the cost of goods and services. Ultimately, that extends from everything to legal services to auto mechanics or marine services or lawn services, lawn care services, you name it, it would have been impacted by this. But on the business side, I think typically, what we think of and what we know is the impact here is mostly on small business, right? It's the small business who is procuring, they outsource their CPA services, they outsource their legal services, they outsource their HR services. And so those are the individuals who are really getting hammered with this type of a proposal, and paying that additional tax. And so one we haven't seen introduced in a handful of years, one I think we expect to see to continue to come back, simply because the proposal has a very large revenue tag attached to it. So these last three here, I will kind of go through quickly. House Bill 1067 was a proposal by us to deal with a wrinkle in the digital advertising gross revenues tax, which the state passed, kind of this new and novel tax on digital advertising a handful of years ago. However, when they passed that bill, they did not they did not create parity for taxpayers into how they are able to seek a new calculation of a tax, or maybe contest that a tax was assessed incorrectly. And so this looked to create parity between this and most other types of taxes that people would pay, think income tax, think amusement taxes, alcohol taxes, sales taxes, those types of things. That bill did die. It is something we will continue to bring back insofar as the digital advertising tax stays on the books. And then the final two deal with, continuing to push the envelope on military retirement income. Military retirees and veterans, those who are collecting, military retirement. Listen, Maryland is an outlier on this. We really are, we're bringing up the rear on the types of incentives that we give to our veterans and military retirees. Excuse me. For a state like Maryland that has so many challenges with the workforce, what we see is we see a lot of military retirees, they take retirement early and they have 10, 15, 20 years left of a career that they're deciding to move to another state because they can get more bang for their buck on the retirement income and they're not staying here. And so we're experiencing some significant brain drain with veterans here in the state. And so these two components are, one is an all or nothing and one is kind of a step in the right direction. And so the first, Senate Bill 346, House Bill 952, the Keep Our Heroes Home Act, really it eliminated all income tax on military retirement income, which ultimately in our mind is where we want to be. House Bill 713 was kind of the incremental approach. And so where we sit now is military retirees who are over 55 can exempt up to $20,000 from income taxes, and under 55, it's $12,500, I believe. And House Bill 713 basically just eliminates that age threshold that says, well, anybody, regardless of age, is going to be able to exempt up to the $20,000. The existing $20,000 extends to those below 55. So listen, we think that this is, and we will continue to push this envelope. Obviously, the governor signaled last year with his bill to raise that cap that he is interested in doing something for military retirees. I think we will continue to be supportive because it's an asset that we have in Maryland that we are underutilizing significantly. It's a shame that we're seeing people with so much left in their career choose to go have that second career somewhere else and not stay here. In labor and employment, so this is typically an area where the chamber is very, very active. I think what we have spent the most time discussing the last handful of sessions has been the passage of the state's kind of family and medical leave insurance program. And many of you are aware of that. The Department of Labor did bring a bill this year, which for all intents and purposes can be classified as a cleanup bill, helping them with administration, helping to align the paid leave statute, family medical leave insurance statute with other things that are already in the books that businesses are accustomed to. So we opposed the bill as we did have some concerns. There were amendments added to it that alleviated some of those. And so I think the big takeaway for this year's bill is the paid family medical leave program has been delayed again. And so contributions and those that are being paid by employees and employers are going to be delayed until July 1 of 2025. And then benefits cannot be taken or cannot be filed until July 1 of 2026. So all of those items have been moved back. That's very, very important. I think the other major change here that kind of flew under the radar, and this is for businesses in particular who are looking to get exempted from the state plan and would offer their own benefits or their own plan, is they made a really small change that is fairly significant. They removed the ability for a private employer to meet the confines or the minimum benefits required by the state program through a combination of privately offered items and those that they may acquire on the private market. So think I have a health insurance plan which may cover XYZ, and then I self-insure for the rest of it. That is no longer allowed. A business will have to pick one or the other. They're either going to have to find a private option that provides 100% of the benefits that they have to do it, or they're going to have to self-insure that and provide 100% of the benefits. There's no longer the allotment for a combination. I think that's concerning in that, listen, it removes an option, and from our perspective, businesses, particularly small businesses, need to be given as many opportunities as possible to find the option that fits them, fits their employees, and is most cost effective. And so I think this is something that I have talked with the Department of Labor about, that we need to continue the discussion, because I think that in reality, that combination plan is what we're going to likely see, particularly a lot of small businesses look at. So Senate Bill 513 and House Bill 525. This is the title of the bill is Employment Discrimination Use of Cannabis Products. I'm going to call this a cannabis testing bill. This bill did fail. I think what the key takeaway here is it's coming back. What this would have done is it would have said that an employer can no longer use the generally accepted tests for cannabis to determine if someone is currently under the influence on the job or not. Obviously, that raises a lot of concerns for those with safety, employee safety sensitive employees and have safety sensitive positions. There was a very robust discussion on this issue this year. This is one we will continue to see. This is one we will continue to engage in. This is a really complicated and nuanced issue area. And so, one, I think I want to definitely put on everyone's radar to be on the lookout for. And then these last two quickly, workplace fraud and prevailing wage violations, penalties and referrals. That passed basically said if you as an employer knowingly misclassify someone as a contractor versus an employee, the fines were raised and you're going to be referred to some federal agencies for action. There were amendments put on that bill to make it slightly more palatable. And then Senate Bill 525 and House Bill 649, wage range transparency. This is probably not new to many of you. This is a bill we have seen for the last handful of years, and several other states have passed bills similar to this. Thankfully, working alongside the bill sponsors and others, a host of amendments were added to this bill to make it much more workable and much easier for businesses to comply with. But moving forward, companies will have to post the wage ranges for the positions. That's the high level takeaway. However, there's a lot of leeway for compliance on the policy that we passed. And so I'm happy to answer any questions in detail on that. Okay. On the transportation side, there was a lot of focus. I talked about the budget at the beginning. Running alongside the budget was a separate issue on the state's transportation trust fund. And so our transportation trust fund that we use to build roads and bridges and keep up the mass transit facilities that we have in the state is underwater. And so there was a focus, a 2-year commission put together to say, hey, how can we look at other ways of funding the transportation system? And so what you see here is a list of proposals that got across the finish line and what the estimated revenue generation from those are. And so all of these were really very separate proposals that were ultimately amended into one larger bill. And so what you can see here, there's an electric vehicle surcharge, which estimated is going to bring in roughly an additional $20 million a year, a new weight-based registration classification, which is going to bring in roughly $169 million a year, a transportation network company fee. So think of Uber and Lyft. There is a statewide fee, 75 cents per trip. This does not this does not supplant local fees. So areas like Ocean City and others that have a local fee, this is in addition to that. Enhanced enforcement on work zone safety, they estimate roughly $30 million a year, and then an increase in the dealer processing charge for purchasing a new car, roughly $15 million a year. So that is kind of the bulk of the transportation proposals. I think we're going to continue to have this transportation proposal discussion next year as this 2-year train commission finishes its work. But I don't think it will be, I think the discussions we'll have in the future will be much larger policy discussions and not so much the individual fee and tax increases. And then lastly here, and just very quickly, we saw again this year, this is the 3rd or 4th year in a row, Unemployment Insurance Modernization Act. So there has been a proposal to kind of overhaul the state's UI system for a handful of years. This, to be frank with you, is probably the last year that it does not pass. I think, listen, next year, the business community is going to need to expect that there is going to be a bill that kind of changes the way the state's UI system operates. And a lot of that has to do with kind of the funding and the solvency of that program. And then the other 2 UI bills we saw, which one was voted down, and this is the disqualification for stoppage of work for labor disputes. And then one that passed is on studying the actively seeking work search requirements. This is particularly in response to what we hear from some industries. Let's take retail or restaurants who experience this ghosting problem where they have a lot of applicants who are simply applying just to remain eligible for unemployment insurance and with no intention of actually trying to take the job if they're granted an interview. So that is kind of it for my side of stuff. I will kick it over to Hannah to cover her bills, and then I will take a look at the questions and see what I can answer.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you all for tuning in today. So I'm just going to jump right in and cover additional policy issues and bills that really stuck out to us as priorities or bills that were concerning and kind of where we focused our time and where we ended up on them. So jumping into healthcare and biopharma. So we saw Senate Bill 626, House Bill 726 come back again this year. And it would have really limited how pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs, can negotiate drug prices on behalf of their clients. And we care about this because employers use fully insured plans, right? Like paying a premium to a health insurance company, which is less risky, but can mean higher costs, or they can use their own funds to provide health coverage to their employees, which is called a self-funded program or plan. I think like the numbers around 60%, over 60% of Americans are on self-funded plans, and a majority of Maryland employers utilize those plans. Obviously, it is riskier for employers, but it can also mean lower costs, especially with, a healthier and younger workforce. So this bill essentially broadly expands state regulations governing PBMs to additional entities, which includes those plans that are subject to ERISA, which is the Federal Employee Retirement Income Security Act, which governs self-funded plans. So like last year's bill, the House version crossed over to the Senate. There continues to be interest in it from the House Health Government Operations Committee, but we have not seen that same interest really over on the Senate side. So I just wanted to flag it, as I think it's important for employers to have on their radar, because it does affect self-funded plans, and it could negatively impact the ability of health plan providers to design their own plans and offer affordable products within them. So again, bill ultimately did not move in the Senate. I'd expect this one to come back. Next bill on the list is a PDAB bill. So for some background, Maryland was the first state to pass and set up a prescription drug affordability board, otherwise called PDAB. This bill first passed in 2019. It was vetoed at the time by Governor Hogan, and then the legislature overrode that veto during the 2020 session. So the board, PDAB, is essentially tasked with finding ways to lower the costs of medication for employees on the state's healthcare plan. So they recently, I think in the news, you might have seen selected, I think, 8 medications to look into for potential caps. So that's kind of where they are in their initial work. But the bill that we saw introduced this session, which would have essentially expanded their authority to the private sector. So it would apply to all residents and not just state employees. So this would allow the board to set upper payment limits on certain prescription drug purchases for anyone. We opposed that bill. over concern of really just allowing government imposed upper payment limits as a way of price setting products in the private market. So, I think there's kind of obvious concerns here. It could slow down innovation. It could make it harder for the state to attract new businesses and investments here. So if you are a drug manufacturing company or a life sciences company, I think this could impact even your ability to secure capital and funding for research and development and grants from the federal government. So those concerns were all definitely echoed by the stakeholders, many stakeholders during the bill's hearing process. Many came in and said that the government should not interfere with the private market through price controls. And really, I think the main point here is the board has not completed its initial work yet. So I think we can certainly expect the bill to come back, especially after the board completes more of their work that they were initially tasked with. And I also mention this because we're seeing a broader focus on this matter from the federal government, looking for more authority to step into the private market and, for example, seize patents if they feel the prices are too high. So it's definitely a focus in the healthcare, pharmaceutical, and drug manufacturing and pricing space. So it's just something to be aware of. All right, business regulations and operations. So the first bill that I want to discuss is a governor bill. It's the Governor's Transparent Government Act. We supported this bill, and it requires state agencies to create a catalog. I think it's by October of this year, of every type of permit or license that they issue. It includes a number of other factors that they have to put in that catalog and that report, like what the permit does, how long it's taking them currently to issue and make a final decision on applications. There's also a piece where they need to recommend or analyze how long it should be taking them to complete the processing of those applications as well. So starting in October of next year, agencies will have to post this information on their website. But the bill really, it's also setting up a government efficiency commission, I think, which will eventually put forward recommendations. But it's important to recognize that Maryland does rank low, very low on the list for our regulatory environment. Many businesses are stuck in years-long backlogs just to get a permit or a license, or sometimes even renewals. And you can imagine our current process may turn away businesses from wanting to invest in our state because of the additional timing, resulting in higher costs, having to extend construction timelines. I think that list goes on. But this bill is important for the business community broadly because it's aiming to improve predictability for businesses. I think long-term, the state's goal will be to actually streamline the permit review process that agencies go through. But first, the data obviously has to be collected and reviewed. So we were happy to support that bill, and it did pass. All right, next bill I want to discuss, another bill that passed that we did support is Senate Bill 821, House Bill 827. So we have increasingly heard from small businesses about how in Maryland they cannot participate in a PEO or a professional employer organization. For those unfamiliar, PEOs offer a number of services to businesses. That could be things like workers' comp benefits, it could be payroll, human resources assistance, or it could be healthcare. They act as an administrative partner to businesses, essentially. And Maryland is one of 3 states, along with Alaska and Maine, that do not allow PEOs to offer aggregated healthcare plans to their clients. So this study bill passed requiring the Maryland Insurance Administration to really just study the impacts of regulating PEOs and the impacts that could have on the small group market in Maryland, and to also look at what other states have done, because again, 47 states and DC do allow it. So that study is due, I think, by the end of this year. We might see some legislation, depending on what that study says, introduced next year or the following year, allowing PEOs to offer aggregated healthcare plans. But this is, again, flagging this because it's important to businesses, because this can allow more flexibility when they're offering health coverage to potential employees and existing employees. It can make businesses more attractive, of course, because they can offer competitive healthcare packages to employees. So it's something we'll certainly continue to have an eye on. All right, energy and environment. There was a lot of climate and energy related legislation this session, which is something we typically see in Maryland. This is an active policy area for us, for sure. So first bill here is the Critical Infrastructure Streamlining Act, which we supported. So data centers took up a lot of focus this session. The governor introduced this bill, which exempts backup generators from the definition of a generation station within the state's CPCN process, the Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity process, which is the process that's used for authorizing someone to like build transmission lines or construct a generating station. But the bill doesn't only apply to data centers; it applies to other critical industries and businesses, like hospitals, where if they lose power and the grid has a blackout, they have to make sure that they have a reliable backup power source so they can protect, sensitive information and data, keep medicine in good shape, keep people alive. So it's also really important, I think, for this bill, and I think this is something that we kind of press throughout session, is that backup generators are used in emergency situations. They're not running every day to power these buildings. And I think the governor's focus continues to be on making Maryland more competitive, right? That's something we've supported as well. And this bill is looking to remove or will remove barriers to growth, especially in our tech sector. It's streamlining the regulatory process for those industries that are relying on backup power. So in emergency situations, they can use reliable backup generators. The chamber, along with a bunch of other stakeholders, along with the state, we've worked for years to attract new industries to Maryland, like technology and data centers. So I think this bill is building on the momentum that the state has built, that we have supported. You got to consider Baltimore was recently named a federal tech hub that opens the door for hundreds of millions of dollars of federal funding to flow into Baltimore, which is great. So there were some amendments, I'll mention, added on the bill. Environmentalists were definitely concerned that the bill was working against the state's climate goals by allowing diesel-powered backup generation. So there was an amendment added to help alleviate their concerns, and that will pool 15% of the state's corporate income tax that these facility owners pay and put it into the Strategic Energy Investment Fund, which is really used to fund climate projects. So I think we're happy with the direction that the bill passed in, and we were very happy to support it. All right, and I just want to provide, there's a number of other bills for this committee. I just want to provide some background in color before I go over them. So the Maryland Department of the Environment released their climate pollution reduction plan a week or two before session started, and it outlined a bunch of recommendations and suggestions that the administration and the legislature can take to meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals, which are 60% by 2031. There were a handful of bills introduced that were pulled directly from that report. I think many of them were introduced knowing that they were probably unlikely to pass, as it's the first year we've seen some of them, and the report had just come out right before session, so there wasn't much time to really digest some of those suggestions. But they were certainly conversation starters, I'll say, and I think that we should expect many of them to come back. So the first one I'll go over is House Bill 1008. This was pulled from MDE's hazardous transportation fee proposal in their report. This bill places a fee on those who are transporting fossil fuel in the state. And the way it was introduced and explained during the bill hearing is that the focus was initially on transporting coal on railroads. And then the sponsor also was kind of in discussions and working on an amendment to add that would apply to natural gas entering through pipelines in Maryland. This amendment, as you can imagine, created a lot more concern, as the cost on transporting natural gas will ultimately be passed down to ratepayers, resulting in higher energy prices for everyone across the board. So ultimately, the bill was not voted on. It did not move this year, but it's just another one to kind of have in the back of your mind to see it come back. All right, next bill I have is Senate Bill 1023, House Bill 1279. So this is the Better Buildings Act. And this would have mandated that any new construction, residential or commercial, must meet electric ready and solar ready standards. And it pretty much can't use fossil fuels to meet their energy conservation requirements. So this includes requirements for EV infrastructure, electric vehicle infrastructure as well. And our concern here was that it's creating barriers to new construction, and it's ultimately eliminating the use of affordable energy in buildings like natural gas. Proponents of the bill, pushed this bill. I think this was one of the top ones that they were pushing, and environmentalists were pushing. And the messaging they were using was that this costs nothing and has no impact on the state's budget. But I think it's really important for legislators and the administration to consider and understand the large cost impacts to construction, and those ultimately purchasing and paying for the new buildings will have. it would have discouraged investment of housing in the state. The governor had a huge focus on housing this session, as I'm sure many of you saw with his housing legislation that he had passed. He was looking to address our housing shortages that we have and the high cost of rent. So, we need to make sure that housing is affordable and available, and this bill would not have helped with that issue. So this bill did not pass either. I would expect it to come back. I think there was a little bit more attention on this bill compared to some of the other newer ones that we've seen. All right, I'll jump down to House Bill 1272. So this was a bill introduced by Delegate Stein that would have required MDE to develop an economy-wide cap and invest program by the end of 2024. So this was another suggestion pulled from the Climate Pollution Reduction Report, and I'll try to explain it. A cap and invest program, it's complex, but it would limit or set a limit on carbon emissions in the state. So it would essentially require businesses, think, fuel suppliers, utilities, railroads, the list goes on, to purchase allowances equal to their emissions. And then the cap would be reduced over time, which would result in fewer emission allowances. So businesses would essentially be faced with increasing compliance costs if they're not reducing their emissions. It was a very short bill. It was 1 or 2 pages. And while I love a short bill, it did lack some structure that we would have liked to see, like guardrails, and really just specifics of what a cap and invest program should look like and what MDE should consider when they're looking at that. And I think it was unclear as well by the language whether the department was to put a program in place or just develop it and not do anything after they put it together. And that's something the Department of Legislative Services pointed out in their fiscal note. They said it's unclear on what the intent of the bill is. So that's kind of where we were on that bill. We did oppose it. It did not pass. I'll note that MDE's Climate Pathway Report, which was issued in June of 2023, that we provided comments on as well. It did model policies like a cap and invest program, but the modeling did lack a lot of important details in there too. So I think a big takeaway from that report is that the economic impact, the annual cost was at least $1 billion on the economy to implement something like this. So it had a high price tag. The bill did not move, did not get brought up for a vote. Before it's mandated that the state develop a program, I think we would like to see stakeholder discussions, maybe studies, and more collaboration on what it should look like in Maryland. So we would, ideally like to see guardrails as well put in potential future legislation. So there's more for us to even comment on when we're involved in that bill process. I think at the bottom line, the last thing I'll note about this is that it's going to cost a lot of money for businesses to purchase credits and invest in expensive emission reduction technologies so they're able to comply with caps. And it's going to increase energy costs, right, on consumers. That's the trickle-down effect. So a lot of thought and work needs to go into a program like this before it is implemented. All right, 2 more items for this topic, this policy committee. So the Renew Act, I'll just briefly flag this. This was a bill that was also introduced last year as well, and it would have established the Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation Payment Program in MDE, which would really just secure payments from fossil fuel businesses that extract fossil fuels or refined petroleum products. So something important to point out here, the legislation's retroactive. It would have applied to any business engaged in the extraction or refinement of oil since January of 2000, so 24 years ago. It also, had potential liability in there of up to $9 billion on prior activities. So there were a lot of concerning pieces in this legislation, like the strict liability provisions. But ultimately, the bill was not brought up for a vote in either committee. And, it was interesting during the hearing in the Senate EEE committee, some members had a lot of skepticism over it. So I think that that's going to be a really tough bill to move along in the legislature in general. I think there are a lot of questions on it, but again, since this is the second year we've seen it, I think we could expect to see it again. All right, so I'll touch on the Building Energy Performance Standards budget amendment that we saw briefly. So some of you may know that in the Climate Solutions Now Act, which is the big climate bill that passed in 2022, it required MDE to adopt building energy performance standards, which they're currently working on those regulations. And in those regulations, it's essentially saying that large buildings need to meet certain GHG reduction standards and site energy use intensity standards. These standards are very stringent and will require building owners to comply and retrofit their buildings or electrify them so they can come into compliance with the standards. So they're essentially designed to force buildings to use less energy. As you can imagine, the cost of complying with the draft regulations is in the billions, especially for older buildings. So during the conference committee discussions that happened in the last few weeks of session on the state's budget, there was an amendment added to the budget backed by the speaker that says MDE cannot use funding to adopt or enforce energy use intensity standards within the regulations until they comply with the specific requirements that were outlined in the Climate Solutions Now Act, along with kind of looking at reporting for what the cost impact and general impact this would be on building owners. You know, this includes benchmarking buildings throughout the state. So they're using actual numbers in the regulations instead of the estimates. And that's supposed to happen for the regs in 2025. So we're waiting to see really at this point how MDE proceeds with the regulations. But I think this amendment in general was helpful to make sure that all the important details are considered. If you own or operate a building that's 35,000 square feet or more in the state, I would pay attention to the regulations. All right, move on to civil liability. So first bill that we have here is a bill that we've seen introduced for the past few years, and it would remove the current cap on non-economic damages and civil actions for personal injury and wrongful death. So the bill had not gone anywhere in the past, but this year there was a Senate crossfile to it. And the Senate, Judicial Proceedings Committee passed an amended version of it, but the House, however, did not move on the bill, so it did die. But I just want to flag this with you all as it could impact all businesses and their insurance premiums. So it's important to be aware of. And just to back up, non-economic damages are the direct expenses of an accident. So you get in an accident, you have your medical bills, or you have your lost wages from missing work. Those are your economic damages. They're quantifiable. Non-economic damages are intangibles like pain and suffering and physical impairment. So that's kind of the difference when we're talking about this. So Maryland enacted a non-economic damages cap in the 80s, and it started at $350,000. And the cap increases each year with an annual escalator, which is $15,000 currently. So the current cap is sitting at $935,000. Maryland chose to enact and put a cap on non-economic damages because it's really difficult to quantify pain and suffering and put a number and price tag on it. So a reasonable cap was put in place to avoid excessive awards. The bill was amended, as I mentioned. So instead of removing the cap altogether, the Senate amended it and it would have nearly doubled it to $1.75 million. And then it would have also increased the annual escalator to $20,000 that it jumps up every year. The supporters of this were the plaintiffs' attorneys, and really their goal, I think, here was for a full removal on the cap. So I think we certainly expect this legislation to come back in some form again, and it's something we'll continue to be involved in, but ultimately it did not pass this year. All right, Senate Bill 452, House Bill 162. So this has to do with liability agreements that recreational facilities have customers sign. When you think of recreational facilities, think of like axe throwing, escape rooms, the trampoline park, water park. The only exemptions are for hotels and lodging establishments that operate a recreational facility. So many businesses require a customer to sign a waiver to reduce their liability, which I think is really important, especially for small businesses operations. What this bill does is in a business's waiver, they cannot have a clause or provision that waives injury by gross negligence. So it's intending to focus on injuries that happen because of a business's negligence, but there could certainly be more claims and litigation because of it. And premiums, I think, for commercial liability insurance could definitely go up. And I think the issue here is really delineating and the gross negligence liability. It's really nuanced. There's a lot of gray area. I like to give the jet ski example. If you own a jet ski company and you give a safety briefing and then somebody's out on the jet ski, they stand up on it to do a flip, but also the throttle wasn't working properly, the customer injured can say, well, that's why they were injured, because the owner failed to ensure the jet ski was 100% safe and working properly, not because they jumped off of a moving jet ski. So it really comes down to he said, she said. You know, I think, look, with this bill, there was kind of a last minute scramble on it. Many were not even aware of it. It was kind of quietly moving under the radar until close to the end of session. So that bill is going to the governor's desk. It did pass. But I think discussions will probably continue over how this impacts liability on both ends and how waivers provide protection from lawsuits. All right, education, workforce development. So I'll just jump right into the first bill here, Senate Bill 511, House Bill 650. One of the chamber's priorities for workforce development is increasing Maryland's current 1-to-1 journey person to apprenticeship ratio in non-hazardous occupations. So this first bill on the slide would have increased the ratio to 1-to-3. So it would allow one journey person to take on up to 3 apprentices at a time. So this is really allowing employers to train multiple apprentices with less burdens, just really on the administrative end. So it's helping with their cost effectiveness, right? It's especially for smaller businesses, that's important. It gives employers more flexibility and really encourages more participation in apprenticeship programs, which is something that we think is really important considering the state has a really big workforce shortage. So the bill was amended into a study where the Department of Labor will analyze the state's current ratio. But, I think there continues to be voices from some unions with concern over the bill as it was originally drafted, even though it only did focus on non-traditional trades and not hazardous trades. So again, study bill passed. Depending on what the report says, we could see another push to come back with a change in the ratio in the future. So we'll continue to be supportive of that. All right, so the Clean Slate Act, so the Clean Slate Initiative is a national initiative that's really looking to pass laws in every state that automatically clears eligible records for people who have completed their sentence and remained crime-free. So this initiative was something that we looked at during the interim and was kind of brought to our attention during the interim. And when the bill was introduced during session, we did support it. And we really, again, look at this as a workforce development measure. Our labor market is ranked one of the worst in the country. So the bill could essentially give employers access to an underutilized workforce almost immediately. And I think the number of Marylanders that would be currently eligible to have their old criminal records fully cleared is somewhere around 400,000. So there's a lot of people that this could apply to. But our current process is really just expensive and time consuming, right? It's hard to navigate. So far, I think it's the number sitting at 12 states have passed clean slate legislation. Some of them are our neighboring states, but the bill didn't pass. We expect something like this to take more than a year for the legislature to discuss and mull over. So I'd expect this bill to come back, and it's something we'll be engaged in. All right, then last bill, and we'll open it up to questions. So House Bill 831. So 831, it would have prohibited cooperative housing associations and homeowners associations from not allowing in-home family child care, or from limiting the number of children that a child care home can take below the number authorized by the state. So this was a bill that we supported because, again, one of our priorities is increasing the availability of childcare in the state, like Andrew mentioned, as it leads to less people, especially women, from participating or rejoining the workforce. So this bill would have been a step in the right direction in allowing family childcare homes to operate more easily. I think we often see that this is restricted because neighbors may not want to see extra cars on the road during pickup and drop off. They don't want to hear children playing outside and be bothered by the noise. So by not allowing these jurisdictions or HOAs to be so restrictive could have really helped expand childcare opportunities for parents looking to return to the workforce. So did not pass. We will continue to have a focus on childcare as a whole and how we can really encourage and incentivize private industry to help with the childcare crisis. So that wraps up our recap of legislation. We obviously don't have enough time to hit on everything. It was a really busy session. I think there were over 2,700 bills filed, big focus on revenue raisers like Andrew talked about. And then obviously the tragedy of the Key Bridge collapse happened and a lot of focus had to be shifted. So we'll go ahead and take some questions. I will open up the Q&A, and Andrew, you may already have been doing it already. So if you have some answers to questions, jump in.
Yeah, I went ahead and I tried to answer as many that I received in the Q&A directly, but we can leave it open for a minute to see if any more come in. And I will also just say, as far as timeline goes, listen, a lot of what we discussed today, we say something is passed or this is the situation. The legislative timeline really still has not finished yet. And so the governor still has until really the end of May, I think it's May 28th, to make final decisions as to whether or not he wants to sign a bill, veto a bill, or allow something to become law without a signature. And so, while we're talking a lot about this, some higher, higher level things that kind of garner a lot of attention could, the timeline doesn't run out for another month or so. So we'll keep an eye out for that. Okay, I'm not seeing any additional questions come in. So I will just say, listen, if you have questions about any of the things we've discussed, please feel free to contact Hannah or myself. As always, be on the lookout. Our final legislative report will be coming out soon. That goes out to all members. Again, you can find that very easily on our website as well. But as always, we appreciate you all, your participation, and don't be shy and let us know your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.